Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to a special video where we're going to do an album ranking for Aerosmith, the Boston-based band that formed back in 1970, meaning this is their 53rd anniversary this year. And outside of adding a touring drummer for Joey Kramer, who is still an official member of the band, Aerosmith is one of the only bands to still have all its original members together. And since this is 2023 and the 50th anniversary of the debut studio album that came out in 1953, I thought it'd be a lot of fun to go ahead and do an album ranking of all 15 studio albums. So stick around for that. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things do help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episodes just like this with an album ranking for Aerosmith. All right, and so as I mentioned, 15 studio albums. We're not doing live albums or compilations, otherwise we'd be here all day. But kicking off at number 15, Honkin on Bobo, that came out in 2004. This is their 14th studio album. And for me, at least, it's the one that grounded their amazing run of success to a halt. It's an all blues covers album, save for one original song called The Grind that's on here. And while, there are a couple brilliant moments in terms of covers that they chose on here, like Roadrunner and Baby Please Don't Go, most of the stuff on here sounds uninspired to me. The biggest issue is that it lacks that Aerosmith stamp on it. The way that they did songs like Train Kept a-Rollin' and stuff like that, I don't feel that they rocked these up to that same degree. So aside from Steven Tyler's voice on these, I feel like there's little in the way of sounding like classic Aerosmith on this. Thing is, the album still sold 500,000 copies, so kudos to them for that. All right, coming in at number 14, Just Push Play from 2001, 13th studio album from the band. Luckily, I got to meet the guys. I had a lot of fun doing that. 13th studio album, too contemporary in my opinion, with all the drum loops and bass beats and all that sort of stuff going on with it. Just a huge misstep of an album where the band tried too hard to grow and change its sound the way that they did back in the 80s for albums like Permanent Vacation and Pump and stuff like that, turning glam. They tried it again here in the late 90s, early 2000s, and this time the modernization just didn't work. It just killed what could have been a great album here. I think there's still some good tracks that are on this album. And recently I've actually found more love for it and spinning it a lot more despite all that stuff that I don't like about it. But as I said, some good tunes are still on here like Jaded, Sunshine, Out of Your Head, but just not enough to save it here. Still, the album would sell 1 million copies, but it doesn't come any higher in my ranking at least. Coming in at number 13, this might be a surprise for some of you out there. The Selftitled album from 1973, debut. While I do like the songs that are on this album here, I just think the recording on it is far too raw. And even Steven Tyler doesn't yet sound like himself on the album. We don't really get that trademark, screams and stuff that he does. I think he was still trying to figure out how he wanted to sound, and I know the label had something to do with that as well on here. But of course, we can't deny the classic track Dream On that's on here, which still sounds amazing. One of the only songs on here I think that really stands out. And so of course it does make an essential album in that regard, but it just doesn't rank very high for me. I know there are people out there that still absolutely love this album. I'm sure if you came up with it originally, you probably do, and it has gone on to sell 2 million copies. Coming in at number 12, Night in the Ruts from 1979, their 6th studio album. Joe Perry left halfway through the recording of this one, and he wouldn't return until 1985's Done with Mirrors. The recording was also rumored to be very problematic as the band was heavily into drug use at this point. Whether that's the issue for lack of cohesion on the album or the quality of music, I guess is anyone's guess at this point. But, you know, outside of the first song, No Surprise, which I really, really like, that's a classic one there, the album doesn't do very much for me. It always just kind of sounded like run-of-the-mill Aerosmith songs on here. Still, the album has gone on to sell 1 million copies. And I think that's one of the key things we're going to see here over and over with the band is they have sold a lot of records despite any, you know, misgivings about a particular album or not. Coming in at number 11, Music from Another Dimension, 2012, 15th studio album, and so far, their last one. I had been hoping we were going to get one for the 50th anniversary, but I don't think that we are, considering they just announced a greatest hits package. So that's why I'm doing this album ranking here. You know, it's the only album without a certification, but I don't think that that has to do with lack of quality on the album. I think it has everything to do with the era and streaming and stuff like that, because most albums that have come out in the last decade or so do not hit sales marks simply based on the loss to streaming. The album does have some really good songs on it, including ones from back in the day that they dusted off and completed for this album. Case in point, the first single, Legendary Child, was actually a song from 1991 that they recorded for Get a Grip and just didn't use. However, the band, I think, crammed far too much on this album with 15 tracks. There's some filler on here, with one of them being Can't Stop Loving You featuring Carrie Underwood. And for me at least, it's just a bit cringy with the age of Steven Tyler singing with a young Carrie Underwood on here. And I get it, they're just duetting and nothing more than that, but it just doesn't work well for me in that regard. Keeps the album from being a classic with the filler that's on here and why it is placing at number 11 for me. Coming in at number 10, this one moved up quite a bit for me, and I'll explain why here in just a bit. Done with Mirrors, 1985 release. I like that I managed to get a copy of this that only reads correctly when you place it in a mirror. As the original album was. If you go buy a copy of this today, they have reversed it on there, but that was the original album cover. 8th studio album, comeback album, and reunion album for the band, featuring the return of original guitarist Joe Perry, who originally left in 1979, and Brad Whitford, who would leave 2 years later in 1981. However, upon release, it didn't really live up to the commercial expectations that whether the band, but certainly the label was expecting. It only achieved gold status, which is the same thing that the previous albums had been doing, both with and without the original members. My feeling is they should not have covered the Joe Perry Project song, Let the Music Do the Talking. It was barely different than the original version. Joe's version was already a smoking hot rockin' track there. So for me, at least, it made it feel like the band lacked ideas, and a lot of the rest of the stuff that was on the album just didn't spark my interest the way that that one song did, but I already knew it from the Joe Perry Project. Now, as I mentioned, in later years, I've started spinning this one a lot more and enjoying it. I have found love for the album, probably because I haven't listened to it so much, so it feels a little fresh in that regard now, and now I hear it more for what it is, which is more of the 70s era sound than what they were going to become on Permanent Vacation and Pump going forward. Okay, coming in at number 9, Nine Lives from 1997. This too being an original album cover. They would later change it because different groups got up in arms over that imagery there. Didn't like that the band was using it. 12th studio album, first album for them to return on Columbia Records after being on Geffen Records for a decade, having all that great success and everything. It led to a really huge record deal being signed based on that previous success. But the album was mostly cookie cutter songs, in my opinion, trying to match previous hits from the late 80s and early 90s. Still, it wasn't all bad. It continued the style and vein of Get a Grip. But in 1997, I just feel that fans were over that at that point. They were expecting perhaps a return to form sound for the albums that had been recorded on Columbia Records back in the 70s and early 80s. That didn't happen here. The thing is, the album would still go on to sell 2 million copies, which is nothing to sneeze at, but it's one of those albums that I don't look at as fond of as, say, other ones that came before it. All right, coming in at number 8. This one might also be a surprise to some people, but I know there are those out there that love it as much as I do. Rockin' a Hard Place from 1982, the 7th studio album from the band, and the only one that doesn't feature original guitarist Joe Perry, who left in 1979, and Brad Whitford. Now, Brad Whitford did have some rhythm guitars on Lightning Strikes, but he does not play on the whole album. He left during the recording of this. And so they brought in Jimmy Crespo and Rick Dufay, who I think do an absolute amazing job on here. And Jimmy Crespo co-wrote most of the songs with Steven Tyler, showing that a new writing pair could form and happen and be just as good. Even if the album wasn't hugely successful, could still be just as good. And I think it's a very underrated album, especially within the Aerosmith catalog. But as I said, I know many of you guys out there do enjoy it as much as I do. The album would only go gold, so it was only a matter of time before the band started calling for, or deciding to, reunite with its original guitar players, ending the very short-lived era that is Rockin' a Hard Place. All right, coming in at number 7, and a lot of you guys might think this one should be a bit higher, Toys in the Attic from 1975, 3rd studio album, their breakthrough album, featuring some mega hits on here. Toys in the Attic, Sweet Emotion, the original version of Walk This Way. Never cared much for the Run DMC one, but I know that broke the band big again, so hats off to it, but I do love the original. This is also Aerosmith's biggest selling album, having sold over 9 million copies in the US alone, second only to Get a Grip, which has 7 million in sales, and just saw also that Pump has now reached 7 million in sales. So again, kudos to Aerosmith for all the album sales. But outside of the hits on this album, I'm really not a fan of this album as a whole. Just doesn't have the consistency and flow that I like from Aerosmith albums, rocking all the way through kind of a thing, with songs like Uncle Salty, Big 10-Inch Record, which is actually a cover of a 1952 hit. And I think it feels really out of place on there. And then You See Me Crying closing the album just really breaks the flow on the album, in my opinion. Doesn't work for me as a whole when I listen to it. Love those hits, but as a whole, I just don't get into this album very often. And so other than that, this is why it doesn't place very high for me in the ranking. But of course, I can't deny those hits that are on it. All right, number 6, Draw the Line from 1977, 5th studio album, often described as the band being uncohesive when they went into the studio to make this album and so forth. But I have to say, it's one of my favorite of that early 70s era of the band. Case in point, the title track, Draw the Line, is one of my all-time favorite Aerosmith songs, which is also why I think this album has gone on to sell 2 million copies, because that song is so strong. But while none of the other songs on here became huge hits, and they're still not being played in their set lists and stuff like that, there's many good ones buried within this. And again, a very cohesive album. But I really like some of the deeper cuts, like Bright Light Fright and The Hand That Feeds. Those two right there have always been fantastic standout songs to me, creating a very solid album from start to finish. Something that I look forward to in when I'm ranking these albums. Are they good, solid albums from start to finish? And that's why I'm ranking this one in at number 7, and it's even beating out Toys in the Attic. Okay, coming in at number 5, Permanent Vacation from 1987. 9th studio album. This one here, second one for Geffen Records after Done With Mirrors. As I said, that one was more of the throwback to the 70s era sound. This one here makes the shift to a predominant sound of the time, which was glam metal, and really returned the band to its previous successes after the last couple albums had underperformed. Remember, Done With Mirrors only went gold, Rockin' a Hard Place only went gold, and so forth. But this one here had 3 bona fide hits on it with Ragdoll, Dude Looks Like a Lady, and Angel. I wish I'd play Angel more live in concert because it was such a big hit at the time and one of my favorite ballads that they do. The album would go on to sell 5 million copies, so as I said, really return them to previous successes and so forth. But the change in sound really did divide the fans at the time, losing a lot of older era 70s fans, but at the same time they gained droves and droves of 80s fans, so kind of all balanced out in the day. I was one of those 80s fans coming into the band at that time. Coming in at number 4, Get a Grip from 1993, 11th studio album from the band. Continued to defy alternative sounds that were the popular thing of the day. Remember, grunge was huge at this time, alternative rock was huge at this time. But it did also update their rock sound a bit for the 90s here and featured a trilogy of singles on MTV with the videos that all went together, which I think is part of the reason why this album was so big for the band. But they also had a lot of chart success with it too. Cryin' went to number 12, Amazing went to number 24, and Crazy went to number 17. So 3 top 40 Billboard Hot 100 hits off this album in 1993 when rock was not a thing. Pretty amazing in and of itself just for being able to achieve that. It did become the band's best-selling album worldwide, selling over 20 million copies. It has sold 7 million copies alone in the US and sits only behind Toys in the Attic with its 9 million in sales. The album was a shining light for rock and the beacon of, where alternative rock and grunge was king of the day. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why so many rock fans gravitated towards it. There's a lot of key things, I think, outside of just musicality on the album that made this album so big. Because I can't really say that this album is that much better than some of their other albums, but it had a lot of other things bringing it the crazy success that it got. But that's why it's coming in at number 4 for me, at least. All right, coming in at number 3, Get Your Wings from 1974, second studio album for the band, follow-up to the debut. Where the band was still kind of finding their way on this one here, and even vocalist Steven Tyler was still looking for his voice on this one. I do think it was leaps and bounds beyond the debut album itself. This one here really hit the mark, and I think while there's still some rawness in the recordings, it worked to the band's effect here, their benefit, and featured some great career-defining songs on this one, far more than the debut album. Same Old Song and Dance, SOS, Train Kept a Rollin', one of the greatest all-time cover songs that they've done, Seasons of Wither, with many of those still being in the band's set list today, constantly being covered by other artists. It's one of the things that drew me back into the older catalog. When I was very young and growing up, I heard a lot of bands covering their material and so forth. But for me, this is the first real sounding Aerosmith album in their catalog. As I said, the rawness worked to their advantage on it, and the amazing songs and everything with this is what brings this one in at number 3. Coming in at number 2, Rocks from 1976, fourth studio album, coming after Toys in the Attic. This one here really hit the nail on the head, in my opinion. The things that were not working on Toys all cleaned up here. This one is a barn burner from start to finish on it. Just makes up for all those missteps, in my opinion. The songwriting, in my opinion, is also even better here with Back in the Saddle, Last Child, Rats in the Cellar, which I always thought was cool because it was an answer to the song Toys in the Attic versus Rats in the Cellar. I always liked that. Nobody's Fault is also a fantastic one. That's one, again, that I would hear bands cover and stuff because I know it wasn't released as a single at the time, but there's a consistency throughout this album, just no lulls or low points, in my opinion, making it one of the best 70s era albums for the band, coming in at number 2. But it easily could have been number 1, though I've got to go with this one here, Pump, 1989, the number 1 Aerosmith album, in my opinion. It was their 10th studio album at the time. It incorporated more keyboards, horns, things like that into it, and it completed the band's transition into more of that glam metal sound that they had started with on Permanent Vacation. For the modern era, though, it really worked for them. They kept the tongue-in-cheek lyrics, that rock and roll swagger, and it just all made, the things that made them huge in the 70s. They continued that here, and it just worked wonders. There were 3 top 10 singles on Billboard Hot 100 charts. We had Love in an Elevator, which went to number 5, Janie's Got a Gun, which went to number 4, and What It Takes, which went to number 9. Ultimately certified 7 times platinum at the time. I remember it was only certified 3 times platinum back in the day, so it has actually sold 4 million more copies since its release, which I think is, again, a testament to how great the album is, that it just keeps selling. All in all, though, lyrically, musically, it really matched up on the songs here. You had the sexy lyrics with sultry music. You had socially conscious lyrics with dramatic music, romantic lyrics with moving music on here. It was just an album that was a complete package from start to finish, and that's why it comes in at number 1 for me. All right, so there you go. All 15 Aerosmith studio albums ranked. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm sure you've got your own opinions on it. Certainly where I've thrown some of those bigger albums in different positions than most people would. Let me know your thoughts. All right, everyone. Have a good one. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.